click on this. I think that's fine. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome to this new interview. Please let us know a little bit about what you do related to COVID, and what's interesting for you. What are your objectives?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I've spent the last 20 years in drug repurposing from a personalized medicine aspect, running initially a personalized medicine consultancy, where the objective was to identify the pathophysiologies in a patient, primarily in patients with cancer, and what is enabling the body to be a friendly host to cancer, and then match those with drugs or off-label uses of drugs in order to alter the terrain and thereby extend the lives of people with cancer and get some of them into remission. So my background's been, digging into the medical literature, finding treatment opportunities that are very overlooked, and there is so much out there that we are missing, and it's being neglected simply because these medications are generics. Now, when COVID-19 broke out, this was very interesting because in December 2019, the FDA and NIH in the US hosted a conference on repurposing generic drugs and all the challenges involved thereby, and no one knew that COVID-19 was around the corner. And in fact, the major move that the FDA and NIH made in that conference was to start adopting real-world evidence. So they launched an app called Cure ID. The idea is to place this, on doctors' phones, and whenever a doctor makes a discovery, usually a serendipitous discovery, but not only, maybe a guided, intentional discovery of a new use for a generic drug, they could post that information there, just answer 4 questions and have that information fed automatically into the NIH FDA database. And already by June of 2020, 150 different treatments had been logged into their system. So that just shows you the potential of what there could be out there for treating COVID-19. Now, as the data was coming in from China, primarily, the blood test results of patients with COVID-19, we started studying it and looking at, what's driving, how does COVID-19 manifest in these patients? And you saw obviously the lung damage, heart damage, kidney damage, liver damage, hypocoagulation, the high D-dimer, the high fibrinogen, the super high ferritin, etc. And then we spent a couple of months digging through the medical literature, searching for generic drugs that could impact these pathophysiologies. And we came up with 4 drugs that had multiple effects on these pathophysiologies. And these included sildenafil, famotidine, bezafibrate, and fenofibrate. We saw opportunities here to, and another very good drug, dipyridamole. And we saw opportunities here to treat COVID-19 in a very safe way, just by targeting the pathophysiologies, but also focusing on drugs that not only obviously are very, very safe, but that also have a broad spectrum antiviral effect. So 3 of these 4 drugs at the time were known to have antiviral effects. And these included dipyridamole, famotidine, and the fibrates. But they weren't specific against COVID-19. What happened over the next few months is other groups started researching these drugs after we published about them in April, and they discovered that they all had very strong anti-SARS-CoV-2 effects, so the direct antiviral effects. So that just shows, the potential of a guided search in the medical literature, looking for drugs that are, very, very safe, well-established. People take these chronically, for 10, 20 years at a time without any, significant problems, and matching them against the pathophysiologies which are prevalent in the disease in COVID-19 and treating patients that way. And, the most interesting thing was that the White House doctor decided to prescribe famotidine for the then president of the US, President Trump, and he considered it safe enough for the president of the United States, who is considered, the most protected individual in the world.
Old, yeah.
And if it's considered safe enough for the president of the United States, the question is, why isn't something like that safe for all of us to try? So the problem with these drugs, they're very, very cheap. They cost, dollars a month. Okay. And there's no commercial interest behind there to finance, the large studies that in the world of science and medical practice we look for. And then the question should be, do we need these large studies in order to, utilize very, very safe drugs? What do we have to lose by just trying them?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this is a rather scientific discussion or it's rather political decisions?
They're intertwined, because science and politics are very intertwined. And when we say politics, I mean, obviously, we're all, the last 20, 30 years being very much locked into the approach of evidence-based medicine, where you have to have large trials, randomized control trials before anything, is proven to work. And that model is simply not suitable, for generic drugs. And this is what the FDA and NIH recognized at that conference in December 2019. There just isn't sufficient funding to allow such clinical trials to take place. And secondly, it's just not suitable in the time of pandemic. In pandemic, we don't have the time, and we have to do whatever is possible for patients who are sick right now with the tool set we have at our disposal. Now, in an intensive care unit setting in hospitals, they do use drugs in off-label fashion. They're treating pathophysiologies. That's how dexamethasone use came about. Steroids were being used, anti-inflammatories. We're throwing anything they can, heparin, etc., anticoagulants, at the pathophysiologies which were identified. But where we really need this to happen is in the community setting, because a hospital system is very overwhelmed and simply not able to keep up with the mass of patients who are presenting with serious COVID-19. If we caught it early, treated people at the very, very beginning, the early stages in the community setting before they deteriorate, then we would be able to prevent patients from, getting to hospitals. So it's very difficult to carry out clinical trials in a community setting, and that's been one of the challenges too. And that brings us back to the question: do we need, these large clinical trials here? And my co-author in these papers, Dr. Alex Jadad of University of Toronto, he's the founder of the Jadad scale. It's behind evidence-based medicine, but he, clearly recognized and agrees that in a pandemic situation, we have to take a different approach over here. We can't follow our traditional, gold standard approach. It's simply not feasible and untenable in a situation of crisis.
Are the situation, of the process of clinical trials has changed because of the pandemic? Do you think that there are more facilities? Are they accelerated?
To me, it doesn't seem that too much has changed. Everyone keeps on saying we need, the randomized controlled trials. What has changed to an extent is carrying out trials in a community setting. A few trials that have taken place or are taking place in a home setting, where patients are provided, iPad or Bluetooth compatible equipment, oximeter, tonometer, different equipment which they can then connect to the digital device and transmit their data live to a centralized database. And that's something new, and that's very, very welcome, because that enables patients to be treated at home and to be monitored very, very closely. But as a whole, I still hear this constant cry, this hasn't been through a randomized controlled trial. And my question very often there is, what's our assumption? Why do we need a randomized controlled trial for a drug, an over-the-counter drug like famotidine, which people are anyway taking chronically for 10, 20 years at a time? If our The suspicion is that there may be a placebo effect. Has anyone claimed that placebo can cure COVID-19? And if placebo can cure COVID-19, shouldn't we be giving these placebos to everyone? I mean, what do we care? If it works, it works. If it's so safe. So our focus has to be primarily on safety over here. And cost is a major factor. A drug that costs a few dollars a month, there is just no financial sponsorship behind it. And, you know, we're used to thinking the solution has to be expensive. It's got to be a monoclonal antibody. It's going to cost thousands of dollars per dose. Something that's so cheap, no one even pays attention to it.
Do you think that they do not, maybe it's exactly because it's cheap, you know, they do not want to buy something cheap. They say, you know, some scientifics here, the one that our French famous professor that, you know, he debated for hydrochloroquine, and it was just, you know, a fight among the doctors and scientifics here that no, you're not right. We cannot use it. It's not safe for patients, and it can even, you know, provoke heart attacks among patients, COVID patients. So he continues saying that, you know, some of the doctors and scientifics are backed by pharmaceutical laboratories. They are paid just to promote the most expensive treatments, even for COVID, you know, even in pandemic situation.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I ascribe to, you know, the conspiracy theories, you know, behind some of these claims. However, it's just a fact that people are very entrenched in the way of thinking. And, you know, physicians are very often consultants for pharma companies, and there's no business model in curing a disease for a few dollars. It's just not sustainable.
That definitely.
Yeah, this is something that Goldman Sachs, you know, put out in a report in 2018, and they were in fact saying there is no sustainable business model in curing diseases. They looked particularly at hepatitis C, where the, you know, drugs Gilead was making in excess of $10 billion a year in profit initially, and that dropped very drastically as they were curing people. So they were asking, is there a sustainable business model in curing disease? So certainly not, you know, when it comes to a pandemic like COVID-19, where things cost dollars, you're not talking about drugs like the hepatitis C drugs, which are $120,000, $140,000 for a 3-month treatment. You're talking things that have a negligible cost. Why would anyone back that?
Yeah, another reason they say that, because, you know, they have mostly focused on vaccine, you know, and vaccination and everything, but they say that no, it's not enough. If you're vaccinated, if all of us are vaccinated, it's not still enough. You know, the pandemic will probably never end, that as far as I could understand. So don't you think that it's because, you know, they just want to promote more vaccination, encouraging people to get vaccinated instead of, you know, finding a treatment or focusing mostly on an accessible, affordable treatment?
Yeah, again, I think it's, you know, we're very used to thinking vaccines as the solution for everything. And, you know, that's the promise the public has been made. And it seems to be the easiest route for public health officials to take. But as you say, this likely will not be the solution for everything. First of all, the vaccines are not 100% effective. Whether it's, you know, 75% or 90 or 95%, there's still going to be substantial numbers of patients for whom this won't work. And secondly, you know, the virus is mutating all the time. And we don't know that these vaccines are going to work for the mutations. And thirdly, you know, these pandemics seem to be becoming more frequent, all these novel viruses that, you know, are being discovered. And we have to be ready in advance. You know, we have to focus on broad spectrum antivirals, anti-inflammatories, drugs that we can, you know, have on the shelf and available to treat you know, pandemics like COVID-19 in an instant. And vaccines, as good as, you know, they seem to be turning out to be, nevertheless, it's taken, you know, a year to get to this stage. And for, unfortunately, many people, that's been too late.
Yeah, it is, you know, we are all very surprised that they have brought to market a vaccine, you know, very fast, very quickly, within 1 year, almost 1 year. But still there is no, they say there is no treatment, you know, and people continue dying. At first they said, no, this is only because people are over the age of 80, 85 with comorbidities, they die. Today they say people over the age of 40. and 60 they die, you know. So it is the age has changed really. They are rather young people who are dying right now, but still they cannot do anything. It is this very strange situation, I think, for everybody, you know, and it's not really assuring, even if we know that there is a vaccine, but we do not know, you know, if it can protect us. If someone is sick, is there a guarantee that there is a treatment? What can you tell us about the efficiency and safety of the current treatments of the new variants of the virus? Do you think that they are efficient on those variants? Does anybody has used them? Is there any research or publication about it?
I think they're very, very early research, but so far I don't think there's any drug
Okay.
where that's turned out to be,
Sure.
that magic cure for COVID-19. I think, what is becoming clearer is that we're going to need a cocktail approach to targeting COVID-19. And the question is, which drugs are going to form part of that cocktail? And the challenge whenever, you have a cocktail approach, a regulator usually wants to see individual trials with each of the drugs and then combination trials, and all of that takes too long. So we really have to focus on the safe drugs. And you mentioned hydroxychloroquine before, and there are safety concerns about it. And some of those may be justified, although you could say the risk-benefit ratio in a patient who's otherwise going to die of COVID-19 may have been a fair choice to use a drug like that. But there are many drugs that are even safer than that. And besides the ones that I mentioned, which is the famotidine, the fibrates, the dipyridamole, and sildenafil, which are extremely safe drugs, there's one which seems even safest around, which is a Japanese alopecia drug, a hair loss drug called cefuranthine. And that's been approved in Japan for about 50 years. It's a alkaloid extracted from a plant called Stephania hayata cephurantha. And while the original use was for treating alopecia areata, which is an autoimmune disease, it's also used in injection form for treating snake bites. And there's a lot of research going on with it now in treating cancer, and it's used in off-label form in Japan for treating cancer. It has very broad spectrum antiviral effects, also anti-inflammatory effects. And there have been several studies, screening studies, including most recently by the NIH, where they screened in excess of 2,000 approved compounds. And there was consensus, I think, amongst already 4 or 5 studies, that cefuranthine is the #1 candidate of choice for treating COVID-19. Now, here you have a plant extract that's extremely safe, approved in Japan, not so easy to access, and it's a generic. So there are patients who are aware of this, who are placing orders from pharmacies in Japan and pile stocking cefuranthine just in case they develop COVID-19. And I'm aware of people who are taking it prophylactically, and so far so good. They haven't been infected. We can't obviously know if it's a result of that. But this is an example of something that exists in nature, a huge potential over here, and there's no profit potential in it. So no one's really looking at it. That's sad.
Okay. Here in France, for a while, the doctors were, they couldn't even prescribe, it was prohibited by law, the hydrochloroquine or any other treatment like that. So there was a big debate, a social debate about it, why doctors cannot prescribe, a treatment that they recognize it is safe and it can save lives. So I think, do you think that there is enough communication and education for the doctors today? Are they aware of the possibilities, of the choices that exist on the market, such as the examples that you gave? Do you think that most of them, at least, I do not know, half of them are aware of this? I think in France, no, they are not aware of it. I can tell you, because in my family, there are a good number of doctors, and I think that they do not know.
I think you're right. Mostly doctors are not aware of all the treatment possibilities, and there's a good reason for that. Every week there's 45,000 new publications in the medical literature. It's about 2.5 million new publications a year, and it's just impossible to keep on top of all of that. Studies have shown that doctors at best read 6 new studies a week, and generally those studies they tend to read are the ones left for them by the pharma company drug reps. So all the time we're drowning in information and starving for knowledge. And uh, considering that there are 9,500 approved drugs in the world, 500 or so of which are covered by patents and promoted by pharmaceutical companies, and 9,000 generics. And every generic drug that's been around 20 to 40 years has between 20 and 80 or even more off-label uses. There's no way for a doctor to keep up to date with all of that. And one of the most important projects I've been involved in through a nonprofit, MedInsight, is to educate patients and use the patients as the messengers to deliver the message to the physicians. Because physicians want to know, they just don't have the time to go out there and dig for information. But the patient has the highest vested interest in recovering from whatever illness they have. And we've done this with a particular drug called low-dose naltrexone. Naltrexone is a well-known opioid antagonist. And when it's used at a very low dose, it has a beneficial effect on autoimmune diseases, cancer, because it regulates cell growth as an antiviral. In fact, there are studies going on now in the US using it for COVID-19. We don't have results of those yet, but those studies are ongoing. And low-dose naltrexone is an example of a drug that went from complete ignorance, where medical community was unaware of the potential of this drug. It had been discovered in 1980 in Penn State University to have an anti-cancer effect. Around the year 2000, there was a physician in New York who's no longer alive, Dr. Bernard Behari, was using it for multiple sclerosis and was already treating 2,000 people with it. But the drug wasn't going anywhere. In 2002, started a clinical trial at Penn State University for Crohn's disease. And the trial was very successful. There was an 89% success rate, response rate, and a fairly high remission rate. And then the world started to take notice, and we launched a portal called LDN Science, a nonprofit educational portal to educate physicians through patients. So basically bring the information to patients, let them then deliver it to physicians. And the most important aspect of this, the drug is so safe. And this drug has gone from, a single indication to now over 60 indications which have been clinically studied by over 100 academic institutions, and another 50 indications for which patients are using this drug, but studies have not yet been carried out or completed for. So this is an amazing, drug which developed originally for treating, and still in use for treating, opioid addiction. But when you use it at a very low dose, which is extremely safe, can help over 100 different diseases. And the estimates now, over 500,000 patients worldwide are using this drug. And it's become a patient-driven drug repurposing project, probably the largest in modern medical history. And that's happened, all these studies have actually taken place without any pharma company sponsorship. It's all been sponsored by patients. Patients have advocated or helped raise money, or government, NIH and other NGOs have financed all these studies. So it goes to show you that when patients pick up on important information, and when you manage to distill scientific information in a way that patients can absorb the message, you can make them then the messenger, and very effective messengers, to deliver that information to the doctors, and doctors are then able to prescribe these drugs. So this is obviously only suitable for a generic, where the cost of the drug is so cheap, it's like $1 a day. So, people are willing to pay for it without getting prescription coverage. And most countries in the world allow physicians to prescribe in off-label fashion. There are, some countries that require, special permission for that, but to the best of my knowledge, most countries allow physicians to practice freely. It may mean that the government will not pay for the drug, or insurance may not cover it, and it obviously will mean the physician's exposing himself or herself to liability in case something goes wrong. But this is exactly the point where you're dealing with a generic drug that's been around so many years, and doctors are aware of its safety and convinced that they have nothing to fear. Then most of them are willing to prescribe it if the patient asks for it.
Okay. Do you organize any event for European doctors and patients associations to educate them, especially during the pandemic? I think it's a must. It's wonderful if they can be, become more familiar with the existing treatments and possibilities to save more lives.
So we haven't done anything specifically for European
Or do
physicians.
you plan? Do you plan
Yeah,
to do something?
we did we had a conference at Tel Aviv University via Spark in collaboration with Spark, which is a platform to which many academic institutions around the world belong. So we did that in October 2020 about off-label uses of drugs for treating COVID-19. And we went through I think about 11 or 12 different drugs that are out there, available, accessible, and can be used. And there's been a lot of positive feedback to that. And last week I gave a talk to Spark Europe, which is European academic institutions, about repurposing generic drugs. But we haven't done anything, specifically European targeted for COVID-19. But this is definitely something that can be looked into. There obviously has to
Yeah,
be
because
interest.
people are dying,
Yeah,
it is really regretful, and too many people are dying, and they are younger and younger. So I think something quickly should be done, to save more lives. I think, one of the reasons that they are dying is probably ignorance of the doctors, that they do not know which treatments are possible, and they can use and are affordable. There are many things. Another reason is that doctors are exhausted. They are so
exactly.
tired that they cannot think or take decision, and I think it is really dangerous for patients now. And because the governments, they try to keep the economy, the balance between economy and social life, and so there is not a very serious lockdown, so that's why the number of the infections are still increasing every day. And I'm really afraid that if the doctors are even more tired than today, what will happen to patients? Probably more people will die in a near future. So if you can plan any event, online event, I think it will be very appreciated.
No, absolutely. I think what's important is really for governments to take notice and establish task forces over here. And they have to find the ways to provide funding for trials. And they don't necessarily need to be controlled trials. We have enough historical control data knowing, what the death rate from COVID-19 is, what the hospitalization rate, the complication rate. If we have very safe drugs, it's reasonable to compare these drugs to each other. And
Definitely.
go directly into trials with patients in the home setting. And these things can be done,
Yeah,
for
sure.
relatively a very low amount of money compared to what the economies are losing out every day. That these lockdowns exist and they cannot function normally, and the death rate is so high. So governments have to really take the lead over here, create task forces, find the ways to ease the regulation, create a threshold below which we say these drugs are considered safe enough to try, and allow patients the choice to take these drugs, because there's nothing else available. And patients, should have the right to live. We allow people to make their own choices. We allow them to drink alcohol. We allow people to smoke. And we're very aware of the dangers of those habits. And we're not willing to allow a patient to take a drug in off-label fashion when this drug is so widely used and been around for 40 or 50 years. That makes no sense.
Definitely. Do you have any recommendation for the use of the treatments against the variants? Is there any prevention, any treatment that can prevent or I do not know, fighting the non-severe cases of the COVID with variants, new variants? Is there any known rather affordable, or no matter if it's affordable or not, but
Right.
if there is a treatment that can save lives, do you have any example
Yeah, I don't know
or
if
any
anything that's
recommendation?
specific. Right. I don't know if there's anything specifically targeted at the new variants, but there are drugs that can be used, and particularly if we use drugs in an intelligent fashion. And what I mean with that is, um, people should know what their risk factors are. If people have a hypercoagulative disorder, they are at a much higher risk. And these people can consider taking anticoagulants prophylactically, or at least testing. If a patient were tested for D-dimer levels as soon as they contracted COVID-19, we'd know who's at high risk and who really needs treatment with an anticoagulant and who doesn't. Now, if a patient is taking a statin as a anti-cholesterol medication long-term, they can consider switching to a fibrate, because the fibrates are very broad spectrum anti-SARS-CoV-2 effects. Plus, they support renal function, cardiovascular function, and they lower D-dimer. So dipyridamole, which is used by people to prevent stroke, very broad spectrum antiviral effects. If patients are using Coumadin, they can consider adding this on, or there's a drug in the US, a combination of aspirin and dipyridamole called Agranox. So we have to look at assess patients in a rather than being reactive. We have to be proactive and look at people individually and say, what can we do to de-risk their chance of contracting the virus, or if they do contract the virus, at least they should be able to recover from it quickly. And if people are taking antacids long-term, PPI drugs, then we can consider putting them on famotidine or cimetidine instead. The data coming in is showing some effect for these drugs in preventing and treating COVID-19, and it's a shame that we're not putting this at the disposal of patients and physicians right now.
Yeah, in French, in one of the French, two of the French university hospitals, they have discovered some of the antidepressant medications are also, they have had a role in prevention. So those patients with, that they used to take these medications for years, they haven't been exposed to COVID-19 during the first wave, of course. I do not know with variants if it's still efficient, antidepressant, yes or no. And they have given the list of them, because they have worked on 20 different medications that was used in psychiatric hospital. And they found out that 5 out of 20 were really, really efficient in prevention. So that was something about regarding the drug repurposing for COVID that they have done in Paris. So we are really proud of that. But still, you cannot hear about it a lot.
Right.
Nobody, only professionals know that this. Not all of the professionals. Some of them, they are aware that such treatment exists. And can possibly save lives. So
it's fascinating. It's fascinating because in the United States, they've made the discovery that fluvoxamine, which is also an SSRI, is effective in treating COVID-19, but knowing that there are other antidepressants that have that potential, whether it's through antiviral effect or anti-inflammatory effect in the lungs, is really fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also approaching, studying prescription data and associations between prescription drug use and less incidence of COVID-19 or less prevalence of complications. We have those tools at our disposal, and it doesn't need a lot of funding to study those. And one of the findings from a major study like that in Israel, where they looked at not prescription data, but pharmacy data, what patients actually bought, they found a very significant association between coenzyme Q10 intake and lower incidence of COVID-19. And when patients did contract it, much reduced risk of complications and hospitalizations. So there are, many of these drugs just sitting there. We just need to go out and seek them and find out how we use them properly and apply them to more people.
Do you have any final recommendation for increasing the collaboration, international collaboration, at least at knowledge level, exchanging the knowledge, and experience about the current existing treatments? How this can be encouraged?
It's a challenge. We're in the process of establishing a global drug repurposing alliance, and we're going to have a website, drugrepurposing.com, live in the next few months, where we hope to collect all this information that's being, born and produced every day about off-label treatments, whether it's for COVID-19 or any form of drug repurposing, into one place. But at the end of the day, this needs an educational effort, and those educational efforts don't seem to be coming from governments. In the United States, there's the FLCCC, which is an organization, a nonprofit organization, doing it. This is going to be solely, I think, at the moment, the product of non-profit efforts and private philanthropic efforts. And that's where we need to, place the focus. We have to say to ourselves, rather than donating now $1 million to a hospital department, if I can put that money into educating, for $1 million, I can educate many millions of patients around the world about potential treatments for COVID-19 and how many lives can be saved right away if we applied funding, to educational initiatives.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring and useful discussion. Thank you. I just cut the recording. I come back to you. I just